this book because I've always been interested in leadership, but I always thought that there were a lot of great leadership books that have already been written. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of leadership books that are out there. But one of the things that I started to notice when I would give talks, when I would advise organizations around the world, when I would do workshops, even I would get emails from people, the questions always tended to look towards the future. And people would constantly ask me, and they would say, look, we get it. We understand what's happening now. What do you think we need to do now to prepare for leadership in the future? What skills should we be thinking about? What mindsets should we be thinking about? What is it going to take to be a successful leader in the next 10 years and beyond? And that's ultimately why I decided to write the book. And I picked 10 years because it's not too far out where it's unrealistic, and it's also not too close where it's not really practical and where it doesn't make sense to do anything. So that's really where the book came from. It came from my community. It came from all of you. It came from people who were asking me questions about what it's going to take to be a leader in the future. When I was working on this book, we actually came up with all sorts of different cover designs. And you can imagine with a title like The Future Leader, I mean, what sort of images pop into your mind? And first we had this idea to do kind of like a telescope that's looking out into the future. And we had that book cover designed, and I shared that book cover with a lot of people, and a lot of people were like, we can't tell what that is. They couldn't tell it was a telescope because it looked like one of those old-fashioned ones, one of those fancy ones, and people didn't know it was a telescope looking into the future. So we scrapped that idea. Then we decided to look at something like little airplanes. And this is a very stereotypical visual for leaders. Like little airplanes, paper airplanes, and then there's a red one that's in front of a pack leading all the others. And I thought, okay, that's super cliche. Then we tried to look at little sailboats. And there's one little sailboat leading all the other sailboats. And again, we thought, that's super lame. And those covers have already been done. Those concepts have already been done. And then, there were a couple of others that were like that. And then I was having a conversation with my wife, and we were talking about this, and the conversation of the lighthouse came up. And I was like, wait a minute, that actually makes a lot of sense. So my wife actually helped me come up with the book cover, with the concept, the idea of a lighthouse. And it really does make sense when you think about it. And the more that I was thinking about this, the more I was like, that perfectly represents leadership. That perfectly represents who a future leader needs to become. Because a lighthouse, the purpose of a lighthouse is to guide people to safety. It's to help mariners and explorers find their way home, and to make sure that mariners and explorers avoid danger, that they don't get crushed by the rocks, they don't get stuck in shallow waters. And that is the purpose of a leader. A leader is supposed to guide the organization and people to success, and a leader is supposed to make sure that everybody else inside the organization is safe. But leaders need to build themselves up. They need to learn the new skills. They need to learn the new mindsets to become that lighthouse. And then once they become the lighthouse, they have to shine their light onto everybody else and onto the sea of uncertainty that we are all a part of. This was actually the hardest book I've written 4 so far, and the research that went into this one and just the sheer logistics of it was completely nuts. So the research was actually broken up into 2 sections. The first part of the research relied on interviewing CEOs. And when I first started this project, I thought, how many CEOs could I possibly interview? And I set the goal of doing like 50. And I thought, if I can get 50 CEOs, that's great. And in the beginning, I didn't even start with CEOs. I just started with senior executives in organizations. EVPs, SVPs, CXOs, chief operations officers or HR officers. And I thought, that's okay, but wouldn't it be cool if I could interview the most senior leaders in organizations? The ones who are ultimately responsible for everything that happens in that business. And so I started reaching out to a couple of CEOs. And some of these CEOs I've worked with, some of the CEOs have brought me in to speak with their teams. So I had a couple of relationships already. And so we started doing these interviews with CEOs, and I interviewed 20. And then I reached out to more, and another 20 said yes. And then I reached out to more and more and more. And I set the goal at 80, and I kept reaching out to more, and they kept wanting to talk to me, and then I reached out to even more, and ultimately we ended up on 140. Now, I don't want to make it sound like this was easy, because from the 140 CEOs who said yes, there were probably hundreds who also said no. And they said no for various reasons. Maybe they didn't want to share what they were doing because of competition. Maybe they were too busy. Maybe they, who knows, right? Oftentimes there are gatekeepers, there are PR people who say no on behalf of these CEOs. But hundreds of leaders, hundreds of organizations actually told me no. So that was the first part, is interviewing the 140 CEOs. Interviewing these 140 CEOs in itself was a difficult task, because it's not like I could just pick up the phone and say, hey Bill, hey Marissa, let's chat, let's go grab a coffee. No, these things had to be scheduled, these things had to be rescheduled, these things had to be planned weeks, sometimes months in advance. The CEOs I interviewed were international, so sometimes these calls were at like 6 in the morning, sometimes they were at 9, 10 o'clock at night. My schedule for probably a solid year was just like madness. My wife was not very thrilled with that, but she was very supportive in it, and ultimately, we were able to make it work. But even after these CEOs took place, the next step was to get the permission forms. And my publisher Wiley said that I have set the record for the most number of permission forms that any author had to turn in to them. Because keep in mind, 140 CEOs means 140 permission forms. And all the CEOs and all the companies wanted different changes made, and they wanted their legal teams involved, and it was just a complete nightmare. So that was one of the really, really hard things that required getting the permission from these CEOs, because I share quotes, I share their stories, so it was not easy to make that happen. The phone call, the spending the 45, 60 minutes, that's not so bad, but just getting the permission to do that was a complete nightmare. But by the way, so anybody watching this, I appreciate all the legal teams, all the CEOs, all the executive assistants we had to coordinate with, all the PR people. So thank you for all of you for making that happen. The second part of the research project was in partnership with LinkedIn. And LinkedIn was very, very supportive. I reached out to them and pitched them this idea. And they have a big focus on leadership as well. And they very graciously agreed to support this project. And we had to do it within a certain window. So that too was, we had to work to schedule it. We had to set up time to run the survey. We had to look at the data and the results. And LinkedIn was a fantastic partner in making this happen. And so we surveyed 14,000 employees around the world, almost 14,000 employees around the world. And these are all members of LinkedIn who self-identified as being employed full-time. And we looked at several countries all over the place and got different perspectives and insights. And really what this allowed me to do is to compare the responses from CEOs and then sort of slice and dice across the organization. So looking at individual contributors, mid-level managers, senior executives, geographic location, we looked at industry, we looked at all sorts of things. I couldn't even share all of the research and the insights in the book, but we shared a lot of the major insights in there. So that was the research that went into this. Interviewing 140 CEOs and surveying almost 14,000 employees around the world. It's the most challenging and extensive research project that I've ever done. And from what I understand, there's no other research project like this that's ever been done specifically looking at the future of leadership that brings together the CEO interviews and their insights and combining it with actual survey data. So I hope when all of you watching this get the book and read through the book, you're going to find a lot of that research and insights very valuable. So the Notable 9 is a collection of those 4 mindsets and 5 skills. And the 4 mindsets are the mindset of the global citizen, the mindset of the chef. Let's see if I can even remember all these mindsets and all these skills. So the mindset of the global citizen, the mindset of the chef, the mindset of the servant, and the mindset of the explorer. Those are the 4 mindsets. And I won't go into detail around what each one of those are because that's going to be a very long video, but we'll be sharing some more stuff about that in the future. And the 5 skills are the skill of the futurist, the skill of the technology teenager, the skill of the coach, the skill of the translator, and the skill of Yoda. That's right, I said the skill of Yoda. And again, I'm going to be talking much more about what those are as we start to share more content and findings from the research. But that's what the Notable 9 is. The essential 4 mindsets and the essential 5 skills that future leaders are going to have to possess if they want to lead effectively. And I also want to stress that, again, this is not opinion, this is not just observation, this is what 140 of the world's top CEOs have told me. And my hope is that if 140 of the world's top CEOs have told me this, that all of you watching, that organizations, that leaders around the world are going to find that compelling enough to want to learn about these things and to practice these things themselves.